Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. This is our 122nd show. Today's guest is Mark Minukas, co-author of Unfear. Mark, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Appreciate it.
So glad to have you here today. So let's start off with your professional background. So tell us a little bit about your professional background.
Yeah, so I started my professional background as a Navy officer. I was a civil engineer and a diver, and I went to school for engineering as well. When I got out of the Navy after about 7 years, I shifted gears completely and went into management consulting. So I worked at a big firm for 8 years, where I focused quite a bit on big operational transformation efforts. So a lot of lean transformations in manufacturing, and then financial services and government as well. And then I shifted gears a little over 12 years ago, and I had a failed tech startup. I tried my hand at something completely different, learned that failure isn't such a bad thing, but also rediscovered my love for consulting. And I got back into consulting, and I now run this firm, Co-Creation Partners, which focuses on culture change as well as operational transformation in organizations.
Thank you so much for your service to country. And you work for McKinsey, right?
That was right. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, you've got good bragging rights. Your parents at least have bragging rights. The fact you work for McKinsey, that's a great firm. I taught at Wharton for 10 years, and a lot of my students work for McKinsey. And then we take the best and brightest. So congratulations on working for them. And what a great experience for you. It
was. Yeah. Great learning experience. And learned a lot, of what works. I also learned some of what doesn't work as well. And I've incorporated that into, the work that I do today.
Well, that's awesome. So why did you and your co-author write this book?
So we wrote this book partly because we saw a real problem in the world that wasn't being adequately addressed. And we wanted to find a way to describe the work that we were doing with clients, and just systematize our whole approach and just clarify for people. So that was a real main impetus. And if I reflect on my own life, I'm more of a systems thinker, and so I've always been searching for what's that key leverage point in the system to create real systemic, large scale sustained change. And fear was one of those leverage points. And from my business partner Gaurav, his perspective, he comes at business, eventually made his way to a spiritual point of view, and he's trying to bring spirituality into business as a way to create real performance and human well-being. And so together, these ideas form the basis for our book.
Tell us a little bit about your partner.
Yeah, so Gaurav Bhatnagar, he co-founded or founded Co-Creation Partners over 15 years ago. He's a former McKinsey guy as well. And, the basic story of his life is he grew up in India and moved out of India, was a really competitive guy, eventually made his way to McKinsey, where he was doing marketing work. But then McKinsey went through a downturn when he had moved to South Africa. And instead of getting let off, he got moved into this culture improvement effort in the South African office. And he went kicking and screaming into that, thinking it was complete, bull, for lack of a better term. But he learned through that work how transformative, it could be. And it actually transformed his life. He used to have this point of view that, you could either be successful or you could be happy. And he was really successful, but he was completely stressed out, and his health was deteriorating, and his marriage was on the rocks. And, through this work, he realized that he could actually be successful and happy. And, it's big insight, obviously, and quite a bit of depth to it. But then he decided he wanted to devote his whole life to, bring some of these insights to organizations.
Well, I think when you work for someone like McKinsey, they gobble up so much of your life that you've got to, just like people who are work at Goldman Sachs, a lot of times they don't last long, not because they can't do the work, but because the work-life balance disappears, and you're traveling all the time.
Yeah, and they attract people who are already probably prone to being burnout and stressed out. And I had that experience myself. I was a very hyper-competitive person before I even went to McKinsey, and I probably sought McKinsey out because of that reason. And then it just gets supercharged, when you're in an environment like that. And there's good aspects to that, but there's also some dark sides to living life in that way.
Yeah, and I'm sure you learned a lot that reflects in this book about fear and managing and all the different management styles, because that's the beauty of working for somebody like McKinsey is you get to see so many different corporate cultures.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a fascinating thing, both at McKinsey and my work now is you get to see so many different organizations, and we work across industries. So we see, the private sector and across industries and nonprofits and government. And we see, both the similarities, but also some of the differences across those different environments.
So how do you define fear in the corporate world?
Yeah, I would define it just, in the psychological sense as well. I think fear is simply the perception that something is threatening, or it's the emotion that is associated with the perception that something is threatening. And so, for us as human beings, we experience that all over the place, in our own lives, but also in our teams and our organizations.
I mean, because people, have fear of failure. They have fear of, like, I've jumped out of an airplane, really liked it. Most people aren't going to do that. So they wonder if the elevator goes to the top of my head. But is the fear any different in business for people, or it's relatively the same? Fear is fear.
I think fear is fear, the experience of it, but there's a really important distinction to make between physical fear and emotional fear. So fear is it's an adaptive emotion. If we didn't have fear, we probably wouldn't have survived as a species. The challenges in our modern world and our corporations, what is threatening to us? It's not our physical body that's being threatened. It's really our sense of self, or our ego, or our identity with certain beliefs that feel threatened in the work environment. And those become really interesting to think about, because they're not, they're mediated through our interpretations and our perceptions and stories. And so there's more scope there to change them, but they're just as real to our brains as threats to our physical body.
You start in the beginning of the book talking about how technology has increased, not decreased, fear and anxiety. Talk about that, and what are leaders doing about it? Because it's really impacting people psychologically and the burnout factor.
Yeah. Well, in general, fear is very much linked to our perception of uncertainty, or the potential for the loss of something, and we can get deeper into that. But technology just brings change and disruption. And so it creates uncertainty in the work world and in our lives. And so naturally fear will come along with that perception of uncertainty. I don't know that leaders are really doing enough to address that as an issue. I think there's a lot of talk about, well, how to, change management, and how do we create buy-in for, people to adopt these technologies that we're bringing into the workplace. But I do think, and this is one reason why we wrote the book, is this idea of fear is sort of underappreciated. It works beneath the surface. It's sort of, people acknowledge that it's there, it's intuitive, but they don't really have really good strategies for how to surface it and deal with it. So I think it's underaddressed at this point.
The other day in the Wall Street Journal, they talked about that CEOs are going to change the way they operate from supposedly being soft. I don't know if you saw this, it was a front page story, to where they're going to be more demanding. And I've never seen a period where they weren't more demanding. And everybody, as soon as the market goes sideways, then people say, oh, we need to make these changes. But the fact is that you can only get so much out of people regardless. And I don't think people are ever coasting, because especially in startups and early stage companies and public companies, where the demand quarter to quarter is so great for revenue. So what's your take on this? That, it sounds to me like there's going to be more fear, that they're going to be using more stick than carrot going forward because of this current panic with the stock market going down.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful, I think there's a belief there, an assumption We talk about this in the book. It's sort of a false dichotomy between either having to use fear to motivate people or saying, look, that's not a good thing. We don't want to use fear to motivate people. Therefore, we need to be soft.
Yeah.
We need to avoid fear and almost, protect people and coddle them and almost treat them like children.
And give
I think
everybody
that's
a
completely
trophy.
false choice. What's that? Yeah,
And give
everyone gets a
everybody a
trophy.
trophy.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And there's the false belief. Either we need to be tough and hard edge and demand from people, and that's just the way it is. That's the way business has to be run. Or we say, well, that's not good. And now we need to be soft. But I think there really is a third way. And that's, understanding fear and how we relate to it in a different way is sort of the key to figure out that third way.
You wrote that fear is not the problem. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so just building on that idea of that false dichotomy, that dichotomy results because people see fear as either good or bad. If it's a good thing, maybe we say, look, it just is, and it's good because it motivates people, or it's bad because we don't want people to feel afraid and it's not a positive emotion. But really, the trick is to reframe fear and to see it as a cue for learning and growth. It's neither good or bad. It's just a signal that we have something to learn. When our physical body's not at risk, it's a cue that we have something to learn. There's some situation that we can figure out how to show up in a different way and be more effective than we have in the past.
In the book, you mentioned three key aspects of fear. What are they, and why are they important?
Yeah, so one is just where fear comes from. The second is how we try to deal with it. And then the third is what the long-term impacts are. So we talked about this a little bit, where fear comes from. It comes from this sense that we may lose something that's important to us, or that something's threatening. So situations that are uncertain, they'll just naturally generate fear. So how we try to deal with fear is it's kind of gets back to that false dichotomy. We either try to use fear to motivate, or we just try to avoid fear. And so it just becomes this overly simplistic view of what it is. We either just ignore its impacts, or we try to suppress it. And in terms of long-term impacts, there's really an impact to, if you look at the research, both psychological and just scientific research, there's an impact on performance, human performance, as well as well-being. So any sustained level of fear and stress can create almost like a low-grade form of PTSD, that raises stress hormones on a sustained basis, can create metabolic disease and all kinds of other issues. And it also shuts down our creative thinking and our ability to really perform at our best. So it's really not good.
I've run 25 startups. I've never thought it was a good idea to have people under stressful situations. Like, there are CEOs who feel like, oh, the more stress you put on them, the more that they will perform at a higher level. I totally disagree with that concept.
Yeah.
I think that people perform their best when they're relaxed. And there are maybe people who are very good at performing like that, but I think that that's not wise.
Yeah, completely with you there, Mark. And one question we pose in some of our workshops, we ask people, where do you have your most creative thoughts? And people are like, oh, in the shower, when I'm walking in nature, or, doing anything but, sitting down at my desk doing work. And that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
We naturally have our most creative thoughts when we're not under stress, we're not under the gun. And so how much are leaders really creating the conditions for people to think creatively and outside of the box and approach challenging circumstances with new solutions? Or are we really just trying to demand stuff from people and create that stress? It doesn't work that way.
How do leaders use fear to motivate without demotivating people?
Yeah, what I would suggest there for leaders who think fear motivates is to consider what else motivates. So yes, fear is a motivator. The challenge is it creates all those consequences that we talked about. It shuts down creative thinking. It creates long-term health impacts. It'll create attrition in your organization and cause your best people to leave. So the other way to go is to motivate through purpose and meaning. How do we create a story or a vision of the future that is really exciting versus trying to scare people into moving? That's really the essence of it.
I think vision at the end of the day, right? Every successful company you've ever heard of, everybody said, oh my God, I bought into the vision of
Yeah.
what they were doing. That motivated me. That made me work 10, 12 hours a day until
Yeah.
they had to push me out. I mean, like, right, the best companies give unlimited vacation only because they have to push the people out the door. My sister was head of HR for a company where they had to take the laptops away from them to make sure they didn't do any work while they were on vacation.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting is hard work doesn't exhaust us.
Yeah.
It's all the other stuff that we deal with at work, managing other people's egos and dealing with all these, fear-based dynamics that actually exhaust us. And so that's a really important insight in the sense that, people see a vision that's sufficiently exciting. They're going to work really hard for that. That's actually deeply satisfying for us as human beings. But we forget that sometimes as leaders.
Well, I kind of wonder then, you read all the time these studies that say only about 33% of the people are happy with what they do. But I'm guessing that 33% are the ones who are with companies that they buy into the vision, and the other almost 75% are one or more than, I guess, 70% are ones that aren't excited about the vision and feel work is just work and just showing up.
I'm sure that's a big part of it. Yeah, I'm sure that accounts for a lot of that low satisfaction score.
Nothing to fear but fear itself is what Franklin Roosevelt told the nation during the Depression. What can and do we learn from that phrase?
Yeah, I think it's a wise phrase. I mean, if you think of where that phrase came from, I guess it came about during the Depression when Roosevelt was trying to rally the country and come up with creative ways of addressing this situation and not just fall back and be despondent. I think there's a lot of lessons for business leaders today. Again, fear, can motivate, but motivates in a very narrow sort of way. I think it's easy to get people to do very simple tasks or very transactional tasks. Let's say go out and vote. If you're in a really fear-based sort of state of mind, but it doesn't lead to creative thinking. So if you really want to think creatively and stretch and grow and do something different than what's happening today, then it really requires our ability to transcend the fear that might be there.
You say organizations don't transform, people do. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, typical, point of view that a lot of leaders have is if you want to create change, well, you act on the organization. Let's say we change the performance management system and the incentive structure and our processes and org structure and all that other stuff. But really, if you think of what is an organization at its core, it's the people. If you took the people away, there's really no organization. And so if you really want to create any true transformation in an organization, you have to change how a critical mass of people in the organization are thinking and how they're behaving. And so when you can get that critical mass of people to think and behave in a different way, then the whole organizational system transforms on its own. And if you think about it, a lot of what we create in the outside world, whether it's strategies, the processes we put together, the org structures, they're really a manifestation of the beliefs that we have individually and collectively anyway. So if you really want to change a system, you change at that level.
How's the pandemic changed all of this, especially now that you're hearing people don't want to go back to the office? I mean, first it was a fear of, getting sick, but then people say, you know what, I really gotten used to working from home. I kind of like it, especially the under 35 people who don't have children yet, or maybe they do have young children, but they prefer to work from it. Now I'm hearing CEOs saying, maybe I need to demand they come back to the office because since our stock price is falling or revenue is not good, we need to get them in. But I wonder, how do you build a corporate culture if people aren't actually in the building? I mean, if we're all living in our houses, working from there. And for some industries, consulting, that could possibly work. But for most other businesses, that can't work.
Yeah, there's a lot of facets here. I mean, I think in general, if I was to reflect on the COVID pandemic, it's created a lot of additional uncertainty in the world. And so that just naturally, I think, raises a level of fear that people are experiencing. but to get into, corporations and how they're dealing with it, I think there's sort of the symptoms and the causes. I think what is a symptom in my mind anyway is people don't want to come back to work, but that was perhaps a symptom of a poor culture in the first place, where a lot of people don't want to come back to work because it wasn't really satisfying to be around their coworkers, and the environment they were in just wasn't really supportive and generative. So if they can create some distance between that environment and another one, they'll do it. So that's just one reflection, and I see some companies bring people back and they're excited about it, others aren't, but I think that's an underlying symptom of a culture that wasn't very healthy in the first place. But how do you deal with that is interesting, because I think it's really hard to build a generative culture, a really positive culture, if you don't have people working at some level face to face together. I think when you kind of boil people down to a little screen on Zoom or Teams and only have remote interactions, it's really difficult to build strong relationships. It's really difficult to do any sort of sustained creative problem solving. So I think it's a real challenge for organizations, and it's a bit of the chicken and the egg. It's hard to build a culture if you can't get people together, but people don't want to get together in some cases because the culture wasn't that great in the first place and wasn't seen as really valuable and nourishing. So that's something leaders need to navigate through.
It would have been an interesting thing for if the show The Office still existed to have tackled that issue, right?
Yeah. And well, I think it would make for boring TV, because unfortunately, I think all the remote work just really suppresses the drama, both good and bad, in a work environment. It just sort of levels everything off and just makes it all kind of tamped down. And so if there was a lot of bad drama, that's probably a good thing. But if there was a lot of good, positive drama, you're missing out on that as well.
You're right. If you're in a toxic environment, you're just glad to stay home. But if you really enjoyed the people you're around and look forward to seeing them every day, then this was a really bad thing. And for some people, it was very lonely. Why, as you write, do some leaders believe that you either have an exceptional organization at the expense of the employee well-being, or an organization prioritizes the employee's well-being? Yet you write you can have both. So talk about that.
Yeah, so this gets back to that dichotomy. Either leaders believe you use fear to motivate, and they're right. You can get people to move pretty fast on things through fear, and you can create some results in the short term, but there is that long-term impact on human well-being, and you'll probably see a lot of attrition. Now, conversely, if you say, hey, we're just going to focus on people's well-being, you actually suppress the conditions that otherwise create performance. You suppress conflict, and people don't talk about the things they need to talk about. And so the idea is to say, look, fear is neither a good thing or a bad thing, but what we want to do is create real constructive conflict in the organization that doesn't require fear, but it will involve fear. And so if we can see fear in a different way, we can step into all of those difficult conversations and the hard work together with a different mindset and move through it together without having all the negative effects of fear to deal with.
Who have you observed has done it well? Give us some examples of what you've seen.
Yeah, there's a number of organizations that we work with. I don't know if I can name all of them by name necessarily.
Just one or two, and what you observed.
Yeah, so in the book there's a really good case study on BASF, but it's a
my
organization.
Next question.
Yeah. There you go. And that's worth calling out, because that's been a real sustained effort. Started back in 2011, but BASF, it was their Wyandotte, Michigan site, and the series of plants were underperforming significantly, and they had a really poor culture. And there were some outside studies done on here are all the initiatives you need to do to save money and improve the site, but the site leadership decided to take another route, and rather than just go straight into those initiatives, to work on their culture. And so by working on their culture while also working on those initiatives, they were able to generate 10 times more savings than anyone anticipated. And they brought in just 5 years time, brought all these plants up to a really highly profitable level. And they continue to work on this over time as well. The initial culture program that they started back in 2011 is still going strong, and they still do all kinds of work across the site and actually across more of BASF. So, that's just one example of how if you lead with culture, you can actually multiply the impact of all the other things that you have going on.
But they let the people make a lot of this decisions. At least that's what I read in there, that it's not just dictated from the CEO's office or the C-suite group in the leadership of the company, that the employees have a lot of input themselves on how that all should work.
Yeah, it's both and. Everyone sort of has a role. It's not saying, hey, bottom up is the only good way and top down is the only good way.
Right.
It's how do we, do top down and bottom up, and together, work through it. And an important part of engaging the employees is also not just engaging formal leaders, but informal leaders and also the troublemakers. So oftentimes in organizational or improvement efforts, and leaders see troublemakers as bad and to be almost marginalized and removed from the organization. One thing we've discovered over time is that the troublemakers are the ones who actually care the most. They're troublemakers, and they're they're loud about it because they care. And so if you can get those troublemakers to tap into what they care about, but start to do it in a very different, more constructive way or more effective way, they can actually be the sparks for this broader chain reaction that you're trying to create in the organization. And that was a big part of what happened at BASF as well.
Well, what happens often in companies is when you don't harness those troublemakers into something positive, they become your new competitor as they go and start their own thing.
That happens too. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right.
I mean, the founder of Zoom actually wanted to replace his original creation at Cisco Systems. They didn't want it. So he said, do you mind if I leave and go do it myself? Have at it. And he created a $40 billion valued company at the expense of Cisco's own, I forget what their system is called.
WebEx, yeah. Not many people are using WebEx these days, for that reason.
Who talks about WebEx,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And he said, hey, this system will be infinitely easier to use than WebEx. And they just weren't interested.
Yeah, and what I suspect happens, because I see this happen in many organizations, is someone has an idea and they get shut down because it may be threatening to the people who are there. They, some leaders may think, well, that wasn't my idea, or I've got a different idea. And so, these fear-based patterns sort of suppress ideas and limit constructive problem solving and cause really good people to leave and go elsewhere.
So how do you stop that not invented here syndrome, or that, the head, and I've heard this from people, like the head of R&D, if he didn't come up with the idea, then everybody else's idea was stupid.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, so the process we sort of describe is an inside out process. So first and foremost, you need to get individual leaders, both the formal leaders and informal leaders, to reflect for themselves, truly reflect on how they're contributing to the existing culture of the organization. It's very easy for people to fall back into this us versus them mentality. And so there's a process to get people to really step into their own power and say, look, rather than showing up as a victim, I'm going to show up in mastery. And I'm contributing to this problem. So how do I want to show up differently? So it starts with the individual. And then from there, you have to teach teams how to have more effective, difficult conversations and build trust in a way that they haven't really been able to do before, to start to shift those dynamics. And when you have those two building blocks in place, then you can start to work on the organizational system and say, okay, great. When an idea comes up, what are the routines or habits that we have in place as an organization to make sure that we talk about those ideas and, bring them out into light and do something positive with them. And I think another part, if you're really talking about, creating the space for ideas in an organization, is it also requires a lot of celebration, both of the effort and the attempt, even if it didn't work out. So we're really celebrating and encouraging people to do the things that we really want them to do.
There's two questions from the audience. As a remote work become a lot more widespread, how do you foresee startups and large enterprises unfearing better in our increasingly remote environment? That's the first question. And then I'll give you the second question.
Yeah, I love that question. We've worked with some startups who are solely remote organizations, and it's actually quite difficult to form an organization and a culture and work through all the problems when everybody's remote. But the core of it is the senior leaders from the CEO on down have to make developing a strong culture a priority, and not just see solving problems on the product or the technical specifications as the only priority. Those are obviously critical. Don't want to lose sight of those, but you have to make working on the culture a top priority, especially in a remote environment, because otherwise it's not going to happen in a really constructive way.
The second question
have to put time and energy into like bringing people together and talking through all the issues that otherwise might stay hidden.
Second question is, any pros of a remote environment in culture building? That's a good question.
Pros of culture building in a remote environment.
Yeah.
I think there's some. I think the upside of a remote environment is it really does give individuals a lot more autonomy in terms of how they spend their time. And for some people, that really is a plus. My organization, for instance, we're a remote organization as well. We don't have any central office, and people are scattered throughout. And that allows us to attract people. Not everybody has to live in the Washington, D.C. area where I am. We can bring in the best of people from Canada and Europe and other places to do this kind of work. So I think that's obviously the benefit. You have individual flexibility, also flexibility in terms of who can participate. It does require quite a bit of energy and effort to stay connected and to feel like you're part of one team and coordinate.
And have the discipline to do it.
Have the discipline. It takes real energy to make that happen.
In 1996, I ran what they call them a multimedia company, and some of the people wanted to work from home. And I said, I didn't care as long as they got the work done. And I was brought in to turn around this company, and the founder was like, are you out of your mind? How can you make sure that they do the work? I said, they get assigned, they do the work, and if they don't, they're gone. They have the choice of coming back and working in the office, but if they can't get it done, they're gone. Turns out we had over 25% increase in productivity. Wow. Because those people were working all the time.
Yeah, I believe it actually.
Yeah. And we started saying more people could work from home if they wanted to. So we just let it up to the people to make a decision whether they wanted to work from home. I myself have been working from home, even running organizations for 30 years. And I find that I like the fact that you don't have all these meetings gobbling up your time by doing this. I try to reduce the number of meetings because I found them very unproductive.
Yeah, so you can exert a certain amount of control over your day-to-day, which is positive. By the way, I actually think remote work is quite a good thing for individual productivity. The place where it becomes harder to deal with issues is when there's some real conflict going on, when there's like a different point of view. We really need to sit down and we need to talk it out, because even if you're on a video call, you're not reading as much of someone's body language. And what we do, just our brains are naturally wired to fill in the blanks that we're otherwise not getting. So if you're sitting in a meeting with someone, you're reading so much more body language than you are seeing somebody on the screen, and we end up making many more assumptions about where people are coming from, and that causes conflict and other non-constructive things to perpetuate in a remote environment that might not otherwise in a more face-to-face one.
Here's another question. I was teaching side hustling in community housing this weekend. Low-income individuals don't have the financial freedom to make mistakes in life. How do you eliminate fear with low-wage workers? Yeah, because they're in a constant state of fear about how they're going to survive.
Yeah, and the irony here is, look, I think many people are in a very tenuous financial situation. I think that will naturally create a lot of fear. I also see, whether it's fair, appropriate or not, people who are probably in a really solid financial situation, probably feeling or experiencing the same level of insecurity. And maybe it's around finances, it could be around status, or whether or not they're going to get the same promotion. So I think fear is just part of the human condition. But how to deal with that? I mean, I think with anybody, I think the question is, what will allow you to be most effective in this given situation? If being fearful or being stuck in fear is helping you, great. If it's not, what's another way you can be that will allow you to move through that situation even better? Much easier said than done, obviously, because there really is a lived experience that some people are having that means things are very, very tenuous. But I think that's the thought process any of us need to think through, is what allows us to be effective in this situation.
How has you write throughout the book about managing mental mindset, which athletes and entertainers talk about all the time. What are the initial steps to managing one's fears?
Yeah, sports is a great reflection that we can translate to business, but sports players all the time, talk about how they can, visualize what's going on, in the field of play, almost as if they're, above the field of play while they're playing. And they also visualize, positive visualization about, what it is they want to happen. So for us as human beings, we have this amazing power of language and imagination. And so the reflection for us is, how do you apply that to create better outcomes in your life? It's, part of it's mindfulness and realizing that we, if we have a thought, if we have an emotion, it doesn't mean we're identified with that emotion. We can notice it. And if we can notice something going on for ourselves in the moment, then we have more choice over how we handle that situation. We don't have to be quite as reactive. And by having a broader, viewpoint, we can imagine a future that's better than what we have today and work our way into it. So it's, how do you use your mind to create more positive outcomes? It's a habit. It's a pattern. Some people call it mindfulness, and there's all sorts of techniques we could talk about to create it. But essentially, it's how do you become more attuned to what's going on in your mind, but not so over-identified with it that you can't change it.
There are, in the workplace, a variety of fears people have. What are the top 2 or 3 that as a leader you have to be concerned with and address?
Well, I think fear is a very personal thing. So it's kind of, in some ways, it's a bit hard to boil it down to just 1 or 2 in the work world, because you talk to anybody in the world and they'll have a slightly different view on what their fears are. But I do think they boil down to a few fears of loss. We fear a loss of security or safety. So the person who may be feeling really financially insecure, I mean, that's, there's just a fear that I may not be safe or secure, particularly financially. There's a fear of losing status or respect. And then there's a core fear of losing the acceptance of other people, or having a fear of rejection. And so most fears are kind of permutations of those 3 meta fears.
In their book, there are 2 ways a leader can take a company, which you outline 2 cycles: the vicious fear and the virtuous unfear. How do you consciously avoid one over the other? And does any leader think vicious fear is actually a good idea?
No, I don't think anybody thinks vicious fear is a good idea. I think the challenge with, any leadership decision making or any pattern that's happening in an organization is we tend to see the first order effects. We tend to say, well, look, I need to motivate my people and we got to get the numbers done. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my job. And so I'm going to demand that people, do this or that. And that leader in that case would be focused on the first order effect of, do we meet the numbers? But they're not necessarily seeing the second or third order effects, which are, well, the next time around, people aren't going to be as forthcoming about the numbers, if they're bad. And so problems get suppressed, and then trust starts to erode. And then the leader feels like they need to be even more aggressive the next time around to get, what it is they need to get. And so those second and third order effects are what create that vicious fear cycle. So I wouldn't say anybody really wants that, but it's a natural outcome of not really understanding the longer term consequences of our actions. The virtuous unfear cycle is saying, look, let's see those second and third order effects. Let's, see that they're there. And rather than having this either aggressive or passive way of dealing with things. I'm going to have a wiser, more unfair way of handling these situations, even though that may be hard in the moment, because by doing it that way, I'll actually build trust, I'll build creativity into the organization. And next time around, this, cycle becomes easier and easier.
You were talking about Netflix, and they're going to have a significant cut of people, and people are talking about, is the model still working? And I'm thinking, that model works great. I mean, who doesn't have Netflix? But now there just happens to be more choices than Netflix out there. And when Netflix constantly raising the price, which you keep wondering to yourself, how could they possibly be losing money on anything, considering how much people are paying, the number of people, and they have 200 million users? Maybe it's a bigger number than 200 million users, paying about $14 a month. So, how's that even possible? But why are they in such a panic? And people were saying, oh my gosh, the model's broken and so forth. I don't get it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully get that one either, but
and how does the CEO calm them down, where the people and the CEO doesn't go into panic, this automatic, because you see it every time there's some kind of adverse results. Immediately, let's just go start letting people go so we can make Wall Street look like we've responded to this. And hence, everybody is at the edge of fear. I've done 4 turnarounds. And when I had to let people go, I let go everybody in one shot and did not do it over stages. Because then everybody's looking for a job and nobody's actually working. Like, your best people are thinking, geez, I got to get the hell out of here before the axe falls on me. And that's even worse for the business.
Yeah, I see businesses go through that cycle quite a bit. I think part of that's just a function of short-termism. If we're just trying to make the short-term numbers, we tend to lose sight of that, the longer-term, business impact. And, the actions we take today may cause some of our best people to leave in a year's time. Well, now you're having to retrain those people. And, that's sort of a pattern of decline that you probably see through a lot of large organizations. And I think it does get back to, there's some uncertain period of time. If we take a purely short-term view of this, sure, we may survive today, but then you create the conditions for really poor performance longer term. What I would love to see leaders do is balance the two. You obviously need to save the day today, but we also need to appreciate the longer term effects and make sure that we don't overreact today, but really, while we're handling the challenges of today, do it in an unfair way, not a fear-based way. So we really improve the culture as we go and as we work through these challenges.
A question from the audience: as a white male, I have privileged status. Without being privileged, there are systemic factors which can heighten fear. How do you address these in your book, if at all?
So we allude to that. I mean, we don't talk about it too much. Again, I'm a white male, and so there's some things I feel like I really can talk about directly, and some things that it's not my place to say. Gaurav is from India. I may have a different perspective, but I do think this idea of, are we having conversations from a place of fear, or are we having conversations from a place of true curiosity and empathy for another human being is core to the Unfear work. And I suspect it's really core to any diversity, equity, and inclusion issues as well. But these topics are really fraught with fear on all sides, right? People fear of not, feel like they won't be heard or seen, and their lived experience won't be appreciated. And other people fear that they may say the wrong thing. And so I think it's how do we come together and truly be curious and work together and start to see things in a different way because we're having a conversation.
A concept I think is natural to startups, but one large companies are struggle with, which is having a dynamic environment. And Dee Hock, former CEO of Visa, termed chaotic. Did I pronounce that?
Chaotic.
Chaotic.
Yeah.
Can you explain that and what we can learn from that?
Yeah, the sort of there's another dichotomy where you either see a situation as pure chaos or pure order. And order is good because we reduce uncertainty, but when we reduce uncertainty, we extinguish the chance for anything new to emerge. But if we go to the other extreme and just everything's chaotic, then it's hard to exert any sort of control. Everything's just sort of all over the place. And so the idea of chaotic is, how do we create an organizational system that can navigate between those two, where there's not too much order, but there's not too much chaos. And so we talk about, how to create stories and learning routines and other structures that generate that sort of, a little bit of chaos and uncertainty. So new things emerge, but not so much that it's all over the place.
I mean, that's why the Fortune 500 changes so much, is because without that kind of entrepreneurial vibe and everything's the same. I mean, look at Kodak. I mean, Kodak had one of the best names out there in terms of brand, and they had the digital technology, because a lot of that digital technology is used now. But yet the finance guys fought against, abandoning film because they were making so much, but they had to make the leap. And if they didn't make the leap, well, they ended up where the value of that brand is essentially zero, right? I mean, who cares about Kodak?
Yeah. There's sort of this psychological bias against acts of commission versus omission. And I think sometimes organizations grow so big and people become fearful of, well, what if I make the wrong choice? That would look really bad. And so what there's a default to, well, let's not make any choice at all. Let's just keep that status quo going. And really what they need to do is figure out how to place more bets and, live in that sort of zone of, some uncertainty, because that's where new things are going to emerge. That's where you're going to stay ahead of the curve and stay competitive in the market. But that's quite hard. Yeah.
And that's how companies survive.
Yep.
You get hired to reduce fear and anxiety. How do you get the client to realize it's a process without a guaranteed outcome?
Yeah, this is a part of the challenge with our business model, is that there's almost always some leap of faith, because at least when you work on culture, there's often not an immediate direct impact on the bottom line. But how do we do it? And we try to, as much as possible, tie whatever work we're doing to real business outcomes and real business challenges. So it doesn't feel like we're talking about, all this abstract stuff. It's really grounded in the strategy that we're trying to make happen, or some operational improvement program, or some specific, process we're trying to improve. And so that's the way we take the culture stuff and ground it in real tangible business stuff.
There are cancers in every troubled organization, large and small. What's the process for identifying and eliminating them? Now, we're not talking about the troublemaker who wants to make the company better, but there are people who are stars, salespeople, or leaders of a division, and you read about this every day in the Wall Street Journal or other business publications, and people are hesitant to get rid of them, or even on sports teams, because they're such great producers. What's your advice to companies about those kinds of people?
Yeah, I mean, the quick advice is you want to optimize the whole system, not just one person's contribution. And sometimes those superstars can be, they seem great, but they actually can have a tremendously corrosive effect on the overall team dynamics, and therefore the team or the organization's output. All right. And one way we help organizations see that is we talk about the fear archetypes. These patterns of behavior that are really, really fear-based, and what the consequences of those patterns are. And through that process, organizations start to see, wow, there really are some people on the team who may be showing up in a certain way, and they start to see and better understand how it can be corrosive. And so we just shine a spotlight on what those dynamics are. Otherwise they sort of stay hidden.
I mean, it seems like common sense, but obviously not. I mean, look at Kyrie Irving. He's a six-time All-Star. And yet guys who wanted to play with him after a couple seasons, they were like, either he's got to go or I got to go. And everywhere he's been after Cleveland, it's been bad for those teams. As much as he produces great numbers, it's all about him at the end of the day. And you see that in organizations.
And it's about some of the decision makers, the general managers and the coaches who are, prioritizing certain outcomes over other outcomes. Clearly those people aren't prioritizing, the team's win-loss record they're prioritizing something else, or they're just making a fear-based decision to, not address the elephant in the room, so to speak.
Well, we had Ben Simmons here and we got rid of him. And he was a multi-time All-Star. And I actually was a huge Ben Simmons fan until what happened at the end. But I heard a guy from the Eagles. I was at a luncheon, and somebody, the moderator, asked this guy from player personnel of the Eagles and said, what do you think the Eagles should have done with Ben Simmons? He said, never have drafted him. And he said, what do you mean? He says, anybody ever seen the documentary on Ben Simmons when he was at LSU? If you watch that documentary, you have to wonder, what were the Sixers thinking? Because he's all about himself. That's what the guy was talking about, nothing about the team. And he said, no matter how good somebody is, if they're not about the team at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how talented they are.
Yeah, there almost needs to be a broader definition of what it means to be good on the team. It's not just your
individual
your
skill.
shooting percentage. It really needs to be, how effective are you with other team members, and what's your impact on other people.
So how do you get employees and organizations to stretch beyond their comfort zone, which you write is important, and if done with the right process, to see bigger vision for future success? So what do you advise your clients on that?
Yeah, this gets back to, the idea of, are you using fear as a motivator, or are you trying to create a really compelling vision or purpose for the organization to get people to step out? So we all have our well-grooved patterns. We all have our comfort zone, and it takes a lot of courage and personal choice for us to step out of that comfort zone. And, fear is what keeps us in our comfort zone. And so you can push people out for a period of time, but eventually they kind of shut down or leave. And so how do you make it exciting and inspiring to be out of the comfort zone, rather than just, we need to push you out because we told you so? So that gets back to, is there a compelling story that leaders are telling about the direction of the organization, where we've come from and the values that we hold dear and where we need to go and why? That's not all about what we're running away from, but what we're really running towards. And are they effectively engaging people and coming to see that vision as linked to what's in it for them as individuals?
Why is telling about the current reality in negative terms, which is used by many leaders, and we're seeing it now like every day, to motivate, such as if we stand still, we'll get run over, or that the world is changing and we need to change with it? Why is that a bad idea?
It's a bad idea because it gets back to, fear is a motivator, and it becomes a default for a lot of leaders in times of stress. There's something happened, we have to make these short-term numbers, let's move. And, so leaders are creating all these fear-based narratives all the time. The burning platform is the prototypical fear-based story, right? The platform's burning, we got to do something, otherwise everything's going to be lost. And again, it motivates people in the short term, but eventually people become numb to those stories. So the next time you want to use a burning platform story, you have to ratchet up the fear and the drama even more. And eventually people just completely check out, leave the organization, or you just kind of enter this kind of low grade, low performance sort of zone. And so, how do you talk less about where we are, what's bad about today, and more about what's the exciting stuff that we want to move towards? That's the idea.
You write about the importance of treating employees like adults. And what do you mean? And you use Toyota as the poster child for this. So what do they do right, and what can we learn from them? Yeah,
the essence of Toyota, I mean, they're an organization that's held up as a guiding light for what it means to engage the organization in continuous improvement. So, essentially what they do is they trust that people have amazing creative talents, and if we just create the conditions for them to use those talents, they can solve all kinds of problems that help move the business forward. And senior leaders still have a role in setting the direction and making sure people are working on the right issues, but they really trust people in the organization without having to micromanage them to come up with all sorts of smaller solutions that help move the organization forward.
Does that have to do with the Japanese culture? Is that typical in the Japanese culture? Do we see that typical in other cultures, or that's just Toyota?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on Japanese culture as a whole. My sense is they've actually bucked, the traditional Japanese culture in many ways. My sense of the Japanese culture is it tends to be quite hierarchical, and a challenging authority is not necessarily seen as something that's okay to do. But in Toyota, it's a bit different. They've really been mindful at saying, look, we can't create an organization and can't compete on a global scale unless we unleash the creative talents of our people. So how do we do that? We actually need to trust people, and they need to challenge us, and they need to tell us what's getting in the way of their work and how they can do it even better. And so I think it's a bit countercultural is my sense of it.
I thought this was really interesting, and I did not know this. I was surprised to read that 25% of P&G's products come from crowdsourcing using a platform called Innocentive Network. What happened to only that we get it built here, it got sold here, and we don't use outside platforms, and yet they're doing it. And usually people have this fear of that, hey, if somebody could do it from the outside, how am I even going to keep my job? Which means I'm not doing my job if they had to go outside. So how do you make that work? I mean, clearly P&G is making it work, and I had no idea that they were using that.
Yeah, so Gaurav could probably, he came out of P&G years ago, so he could probably speak more to the particulars of that culture and what they do there. But my general sense of that is, yeah, you have to work through people's insecurity of outsourcing part of their job. If you're purely to live in a fear-based sort of a protective way, it would be really hard to entrust other people or the crowd to give you ideas. So it really requires an unfear stance to say, hey, I'm willing to be open to the ideas that you can provide. And rather than having to be the expert myself, I can be the facilitator or the integrator of ideas. So reimagining your role and not being so identified with having to be the one with all the ideas is probably an important part of that process, I would imagine.
How do you let people know that new ideas are welcome and accepted? Because at many of the organizations I ran, I used to make a list of all the new ideas and where they came from. And so when people join the organization, they saw the secretary came up with this, our head of marketing came up with this, somebody in the mailroom came up with this idea, and I listed all the ideas and the outcomes for them. And so it encouraged people to do that. But it was easy for me. I'm running a startup, and this is just how my head's wired. But how do organizations, especially bigger ones that are so bureaucratic, do that?
It's a version of that tactic. I love that, by the way, because it really gets down to how do you celebrate the contributions of other people. And in most organizations I've stepped foot in, they put a lot of energy into assigning consequences when things go bad, negative consequences,
right?
Because they're it's a very protective sort of way of working and risk mitigation. There's less energy put into just celebrating what people do and the ideas that they come up with. So I think the essence of it is there's all kinds of ways to celebrate, but when people come up with ideas, whether they're great ideas or not great ideas, how do you at least celebrate the creativity and the attempt, and even the small little failures when learning still happens? That's really the essence of what you need to do.
So here's a couple questions as we're closing out here. The first question from the audience is, what is the overlap between fear and ethical decision-making? Sanctions can be a tool to mitigate unethical behavior, but fear can also lead to unethical behavior if the organization focuses on meeting numbers, which we saw with Wells Fargo making up all those false accounts.
Yeah. Look, I think fear of bad consequences can be a guide to good decision making, right? That is certainly there. I think if you get stuck in a fear-based way of kind of moving through the world, though, there can be ethical implications for any of those. So in the book, we talk about these different fear archetypes, but basically leadership styles or patterns that show up if we're kind of in this fear-based way. I think there's ethical downsides to any one of them. One, for instance, would be this avoidance pattern. So I fear conflict, and therefore I have a generally avoidant pattern, the way that could tip into unethical behavior is I see something that's bad or wrong, and my general pattern is I don't say anything because I don't want the conflict, and so that could be unethical. So any of these patterns, taken to an extreme can tip into unethical behavior, or at least create some additional risk there.
Here's the last question. How can companies help employees working remotely reduce their isolation and anxiety?
Yeah, all kinds of tactics, I think. One is every once in a while get together in person, if possible. I think it's great to, the remote work ends up working better after people have gotten a chance to get together, have dinner together, just get to know each other, not just over a Zoom call. But I think one very simple tactic I'll give you here in this conversation is this practice called a check-in. But at the start of every meeting, it doesn't have to be every meeting, but some meetings, literally going around the room and just checking in with people to say, how are you feeling today? Do you have any interferences that are preventing you from being fully present? And, maybe there's some other fun question you can add to that as well. But, truly with real curiosity, asking people, how are you doing today? And role modeling yourself as a leader. So if you're having a really bad day or your kid's sick and home and, it's distracting you in the background, just naming that and humanizing the experience of being in a remote environment would help quite a bit. And that would naturally bring people together.
Mark, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. The book was awesome. Your answers were great. And I think, people need to be thinking about that, especially right now, where people are feeling very uneasy, more so now than the pandemic, because the stock market's kind of upside down. And you're hearing all these companies now talk about laying off people. And when you start to hear, Facebook and these guys are saying, hey, we're going to reduce the number of new hires and also get rid of people. Now people have a real sense of fear. And you hear the leadership of companies panicking, questioning their own business models that have been doing really well and making people feel anxious. So I hope people read the book, especially the leaders, read your book, and so that we can see better future outcomes. So thank you so much for taking the time.
You bet. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Have a great day and a great weekend, everybody. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.